Okay, so now we're going to move on from Hutton and Lyell and Lamarck, and we're going to start to talk about Charles Darwin, who's the man that we view as the founder of modern evolutionary theory, as sort of the father of evolution in general, and he's the one that really has shaped our modern understanding of this process of species changing through time. So here's Darwin pictured as an older gentleman, and these are Darwin's finches, which are one of the example organisms, which people often talk about in association with Darwin because they're one of the organisms that he viewed during his lifetime. So Darwin is a really interesting man. He ended up proposing a way in which evolution works, and he called that evolution by natural selection. And that's sort of our starting point in discussing evolution. Darwin, as a man, collected a lot of different pieces of evidence and really strived to find those pieces to support his ideas. He lived from 1809 to 1882. And was primarily a British naturalist. Naturalist being somebody who studied nature, who collected organisms. But that's not really what he started out as. Darwin was trained as, first of all, as a doctor, and then trained as a priest prior to his commitment to naturalism. So like I was just saying, Darwin took a very sort of convoluted or misdirected path on his way to being the man that we see as the father of evolutionary theory. His first career step was to be a doctor, a medical doctor, and he actually began training and going to school and doing dissections as a young man, but really had a problem with one of the things that doctors needed to deal a lot with at the time was blood. He was queasy in seeing blood, and so he decided to change. Sort of up next was his dad suggested that he look into becoming a pastor. A pastor at the time had a pretty leisurely life, good pay, and his dad's one of his main points was that Darwin could still study nature in his off time as a hobby while being a pastor. So Darwin went to school basically for medical and theology, and after completing school, he actually was invited to serve as a doctor / naturalist on this incredible voyage that would go around the world looking to create maps of mostly South America, but a lot of different continents in the Southern Hemisphere. He was chosen because he was educated and he had a slight medical background. So we're going to take a look at this trip that Darwin went on. So it departed in 1831 at the age of 22. Darwin was done with his education, and he set sail on a ship named the Beagle that was going to take a voyage around the world. So to kind of look at the map here, they were basically going to leave Europe, go around the coast of South America, out across the Pacific, come back around, loop around Australia, Africa, and then head back up towards Europe. It's on this trip that Darwin really made all of his observations and collected his piece of evidence that really led him along the path of this idea of evolution. And so Darwin, at all the stops along the way, was always looking at the diversity of the species, how species were similar to species on other continents but different, the locations that they lived in, how they fit their environment, and he really began to ask himself, how could there be so many organisms that were different? Why do they all live in different areas? But how could they also have so many similarities? So differences and similarities. So the captain of the ship on his voyage was a guy named Robert Fitzroy, pictured here. Fitzroy is said to have picked Darwin basically through a mutual friend, and some people say because of the shape of Darwin's nose. Fitzroy was really looking for somebody to hang out with, to talk science, religion, politics with, somebody who was educated on this voyage that was going to take, if you notice, 5 years. So they were going to be gone for 5 years, and Fitzroy was basically looking for a friend. So one of the first pieces of evidence towards the theory of evolution that Darwin was coming across on his trip were fossils. Okay, so very famously in Argentina, Darwin found a fossil of an ancient armadillo, pictured here. and at the same time was making observations of living armadillos, pictured there. He was intrigued by this idea that there was obviously overlap in the shape, okay, and the structure of these organisms, but they were different in size. This one is much larger, okay, and found in the same place. So if these ones were still alive today, pictured up here, these ones were absent today, what was it about the environment that had changed? Why could these ones not still be alive? Why were there not fossils of these ones? And he sort of came up with this idea that maybe this armadillo, eventually he's thinking, changed into the armadillo that we see today. So, fossil. So that was here in Argentina. One of the next main stops was out in the Galapagos Islands. So the Galapagos is a set of islands found right on the equator. So here's the equator right here, off the coast of Ecuador, about 600 kilometers. They're volcanic islands, so they're formed. There's actually a hot spot with the tectonic plates moving towards South America, and so the islands are sort of old on the eastern edge and young on the western edge with active volcanoes. The thing that really Darwin noticed wasn't about how the islands were forming, but the living things that were present on these islands. Our next piece of evidence then that Darwin picked up in the Galapagos was his observations of the unique species present on the different islands. And so there's a couple of things going on here. The Galapagos is a really unique habitat. It's really far out to sea, so you wouldn't think that organisms could swim there. And so the organisms there should sort of tended to be unique. Darwin found tortoises, iguanas, and finches that were all different from those species present in the nearby mainland areas, both by their size, their habitat, their coloration, etc. And so he was sort of trying to think, why would these creatures only be found on those islands? And as, sort of just looking ahead, it's going to be because those islands are unique habitats. Those creatures are adapted to a unique habitat. And so Darwin observed that between islands, so, from one island to the next, that animals and plants varied dramatically, okay? That, for instance, one island could be inhabited with a turtle that has a very much what we would call an intermediate shell. One island would be inhabited by a turtle that have what we'd call a saddleback shell with a high neck piece. And then a different island would be inhabited by a domed shell turtle with a low neck piece. Same thing for finches, that there were finches of different beak sizes on all the different islands. Darwin noticed that you didn't find a high-backed turtle on the same island as a low-backed turtle. And so why do these organisms appear different? Why don't the islands have the same species? Did these species come from the same original ancestor? And these were questions that Darwin was asking himself, because it's kind of strange that you could travel just 20 miles between these islands and find turtles that looked so dramatically different in their shell structure. So this is looking at the finches then, the bird species on the island, and actually some of these are different enough that Darwin didn't even think that he thought he had blackbirds and finches that he was looking at. And he realized later on that they were all just finches. So just kind of look generally at some of the beak sizes, pictured here. We've got some birds with really tiny beaks, birds with very large beaks, and this is all based on the food that they were eating. And so Darwin is fairly interested in that phenomenon. And so Darwin came to realize eventually after his trip that on the islands, on the Galapagos Islands, there were 14 species of birds, all of which were finches, but there's only one finch that's found on the mainland, okay? And so he began to ask himself, what could have been the origin of these 14 species? Did they come from that one original finch on that mainland, Ecuador? And so what he came to realize is that these birds were basically adapted based on their habitat and the foods that they were eating. Now, this is sort of our modern understanding of how the finches came to be, but it's all about the food that they're eating. So our modern understanding of what actually in reality happened with these finches is that there was an original small group of finches, somewhere between 20 and 30 birds based on DNA evidence, that migrated out to these Galapagos Islands, and that they had a small range of variations in their beak characteristics. That these birds then, once they inhabited the islands, the differences in their beak sizes became important. And so the birds with small beaks specialized on small seeds, and the birds with large beaks specialized on large seeds, and that these birds began to favor one another, and they began to survive and reproduce differently, small with small and large with large. And then over time, the small genes separated from the large genes, and that led to the formation of some different species, different bird species, over very large time frames, so that we went from one species of finch up to 14. Now, Darwin didn't know any of this. He was just seeing the end product of this variation, but he was impressed by how different the finches were while still retaining some similarity. So this is then just a look at sort of the modern day phylogenies of these finches. Now this finch, the large cactus finch, is extinct thanks to human influence. But the rest of the 13 are alive today, and they're classified based on finches that eat insects, the tree finches, finches that eat seeds, the ground finches, and then our two warbler finches, which are insect eaters also. But we have sort of three main lineages, 1, 2, and 3, that are diversified out into a variety of species, usually based on size, so small, medium, and large sort of categories of each ground and tree finch. They're widely diversified today, and really an amazing group of species to look at. And so this sort of example organism of the finches has served as a great piece of evidence for evolution, adaptation to environment, change through time, from Darwin's time to today. Now, Darwin didn't find that it was just the finches that varied from island to island, but things like iguanas. So on the mainland, we have a tree-dwelling green iguana. In the islands, we have both a land and marine version of the iguana. So the land iguana lives on the ground, eats cactuses. The marine iguana actually swims out into the ocean and eats algae, seaweed from the bottom of the ocean, swimming through the turf. And so here's 1, 2, 3 different land iguana phenotypes, and 1, 2, 3 different marine iguana phenotypes, all varying in their size, color, habitat, and behavior. By the way, this picture was taken by me on my trip to the Galapagos. So Darwin sat around and he thought about his ideas for about the next 20 years. He became a little bit of a recluse. He married his second cousin, had some children. He and his children all had some health issues, but he sat around every day and thought about evolution. And in doing this, in pondering both the preserved specimens that he brought back and the notes that he had made, he really sort of got to the idea that we had distinct species on the islands from the mainland, and also between the islands, unique species of organisms. Okay, during this time, during his sort of time at home, he also experimented with artificial selection. He began looking at breeders, human breeders, breeding for cattle and dogs. He himself bred pigeons and looked at artificial selection and how that could change species through time, and kind of in his head replaced people choosing who's breeding with nature. And that's how we sort of get at this idea that nature could work like artificial selection. And that's sort of what we're getting to or towards is our idea of natural selection. So this is just a look at the different pigeon breeds, and we have fantails and pigeons with puffy necks and pigeons that had unique flying patterns, etc. These were what Darwin was breeding in his backyard. And so finally in 1858, when Darwin was an old man, he actually received a letter from a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace had basically arrived at this same idea, evolution by natural selection, organisms changing over time because nature is selecting who's passing their genes on independently from Darwin. And so Darwin had this decision to make, is he going to publish or is he going to let somebody else get credit for the ideas that he had come up with? Now, Wallace's ideas were formed not actually in the Galapagos, but in the Malaysian archipelago, which is also a series of islands where Wallace observed both species that originated in Australia and species that originated in Asia interacting and intermixing across these island chains through time. So in the end, Darwin read his paper and Wallace's paper at a scientific meeting, both purporting the theories of evolution by natural selection. And then within about 18 months, Darwin had written his book titled On the Origin of Species, which was the first book to really put out the idea that species are changing through time.